Senator Pocock, welcome to 7:30.
Good evening, Sarah.
What went wrong at the National Anti-Corruption Commission? It's only been in existence for less than 2 years.
Well, we've unfortunately seen the National Anti-Corruption Commission not build the trust that I think is really so necessary. It is critical to have an anti-corruption commission that people look to and that they trust. And I think this latest report, off the back of huge concerns about the NACC not taking forward an investigation into Robodebt, I think shows that there are serious issues that need to be worked out.
Now, to be clear, the Commissioner, Paul Brereton, in this case, that is one of the people referred to the NACC from Robodebt, he did declare his association with one of those people, and according to the NACC, promptly, explicitly and repeatedly. Why isn't that enough of a defence?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if you look at the findings of the inspector, and again, I want to thank the crossbenchers who pushed to actually have an inspector with power. We're seeing now just how important that is. Given what's happened and the Commissioner not properly recusing himself, the NACC has to, the Commissioner of the NACC has to, their integrity has to be beyond reproach. And I'm very concerned that after these findings, that is very much in doubt, and we have to put trust in the NACC and this institution front and centre, and I think it's been a pretty patchy start. Should the Commissioner step down? I think given the need to ensure that there is trust in the NACC, given these findings, I think his position is untenable, but that's ultimately a decision for him, and I'd be urging him to do what is best for the NACC and people's trust in that institution. And does that position that he should step down, is that shared amongst your crossbench colleagues? Have you talked to them about it? I haven't discussed this with them. That's just looking at the facts and the concerns that I've heard from people in the ACT about issues around Robodebt, about the NACC saying that they don't want to investigate pork barrelling. I moved an amendment in the Senate to explicitly say that the NACC can and should investigate pork barrelling if it meets the serious or systemic threshold of corruption. Both the major parties voted against that, and now we're seeing the NACC say, no, we don't think that is actually corruption. That doesn't seem to square with community expectation. So, Senator Pocock, as things stand now, just bringing forward a review of the NACC for you is not enough. It's also got to be, well, you're recommending that the Commissioner himself withdraw himself from that position. I think that is the right thing to do to restore trust in this institution, given what's happened, given the inspector's findings, and given someone who has so much trust placed in them, not properly recusing themselves. It's one thing to say, I have a conflict of interest, but then to sit in those meetings and be involved in discussions to the point of being involved in how you're framing the media release, that really doesn't seem to cut it with what Australians would expect of something that should be beyond reproach, the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Now, there's a crossover issue here because the question is about whether the Commissioner and other officials who are part of the NACC should be members of the Qantas Chairman's Lounge. Well, it'd be very hard if something came up to do with Qantas, and I think this needs to be part of a much broader conversation. We've seen the Prime Minister under fire for whether or not he did or didn't ask for upgrades while he was Transport Minister, whether that's a breach of the Ministerial Code of Conduct. That's worth looking at. But this has to be part of a much broader conversation in Australia about just how ridiculously loose our laws are when it comes to transparency and lobbying and the release of ministerial diaries. It's not up to standard, and we constantly see the major parties voting against reform that is pushed by the crossbench. So the fact that the Prime Minister's office have put out this statement this evening saying that he did not personally solicit those flights from Alan Joyce, does that change your view of the way he conducted himself in relation to Qantas? Well, I think that a lot of people wish he had have said that at the start. Probably could have saved some of his ministers a lot of painful interviews trying to defend him. He could have come out in the start and said, I didn't do this. What I've seen is he said he didn't call Alan Joyce. Were there text messages, emails? But again, this is worth looking into. But let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here. You've got politicians willing to sling mud, but they're not actually willing to address the root causes of this, which is a lobbying system that is just so loose. The Qantas government relations team in Australia are not lobbyists. They have sponsored passes. We learnt in the airline inquiry that the infrastructure minister who made the Qatar decision sponsors passes for the Qantas executive to get access into Parliament House. Previous coalition ministers have done the same. You can't tell me that that is a standard that meets the expectation of Australians.
So what do you want now in relation to this issue about Qantas? You said it's worth looking into the relationship and what exactly and how Anthony Albanese had his contacts with Qantas. When you say worth looking at, do you mean a formal inquiry?
Well, I'm not totally sure how you deal with ministerial code of conduct breaches. I think that seems to be the thing under question. Again, we have rules that you can be the transport minister, get an upgrade from a company that you regulate, and as long as you declare it, it's totally fine. Is that up to standard? The next step I would like to see is actually saying, okay, we're not holding ourselves to a high enough standard as politicians. Let's rethink the way that we do these declarations. Let's look at our lobbying laws. Let's look at this revolving door of resources ministers jumping straight into fossil fuel companies. My message to people when I talk to them is, yes, this is an issue, but the much broader issue is this system that facilitates this cosy relationship between politicians who are meant to be making the rules for industry and industry who don't want those rules made. And is it a surprise that we have a duopoly in the airlines, a duopoly in the supermarkets, a super concentrated banking sector that's incredibly profitable, insurers also concentrated? It's not working for everyday Australians. And so you've got to look at the system that's in place and the lack of transparency and say, surely that needs an overhaul.
And just briefly, if I may, David Pocock, there's only a very short amount of sitting time left in the Senate, and a lot of legislation is held up. You said recently the government is not acting in good faith in negotiations. What's your evidence of that?
Mm-hmm. The Senate has eight days left. Not a lot of times. Things can move pretty slowly in the Senate at times. Well, you take the nature positive legislation that they're calling it, which is basically setting up Environment Protection Australia. It's basically a take it or leave it proposition. There is not good faith negotiations to actually make it independent, to make it the agency that is in line with what experts are saying it needs to be. The housing bill's exactly the same. The minister doesn't seem to actually be able to negotiate. That's what this is about. Politics is actually about negotiating and finding an outcome that squares with what the various people in there and the people that they represent. Lately, it seems like there's almost a want to have a fight over things rather than genuinely negotiating and getting a good outcome. And we've seen that over the last 2 years with a range of pieces of legislation and big reform where I think we've landed in a much better spot after good faith negotiations.
David Pocock, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.